Spritore, vjen më kap, më thot e qore, atë kujtohet kur ishim unë e ti, kur hanim akullaren. Eri fami nis pa pritur, si një post o blokin betur, më pres më ndalon, më kujton, se një pjesë imja që ka tregtur.
Where are you from originally?
I'm Swiss.
And
I'm living with a lot of people from Albania because we have the biggest migration in Switzerland.
Course,
is migration. From Basel.
Okay, so German speaking.
German speaking.
Okay.
Aber Sie sprechen Deutsch, weil Sie in Berlin waren?
Genau,
oder?
ja. Und auch ich habe also Kant und Marx studiert und Hegel und so, deswegen.
Deutscher Idealismus, ich habe schon
genau,
gesehen.
Genau, deswegen.
Da habe ich mich gewundert, warum deutscher Idealismus. Ich mag ja den deutschen Idealismus auch, aber man denkt, ach, wenn jemand von Albanien kommt, hier aufgewachsen ist, da kann man vielleicht neue Denkerinnen und Denker entdecken, vor allem die Griechen.
Ja, genau. Aber ich habe mit der Griechen angefangen und dann man studiert die ganze Geschichte der Philosophie. Und dann kommt man nach Kant und dann Hegel und dann Marx und also das entwickelt so, dass man fängt mit einem Philosophen an und dann hat verschiedene Probleme. Aber Kant habe ich immer hat mir immer sehr gut gefallen.
Wir fahren jetzt ja zu Ihrem Haus, wo Sie aufgewachsen sind, in Ihrer Kindheit. Ich meine, das war ein kommunistisches Land, eine kommunistische Stadt. Man sieht jetzt auch die Wandlungen durch die Marktwirtschaft, Liberalisierung. Aber sagen wir die Orte Ihrer Kindheit, also was sind so die... War es das Haus? Ist es der Strand? War es der Schulweg? Was sind das?
Yeah. So the main one is, I think, the house, and then when we go, I can show you where it is. This where we are now. This is the beach, which was also a part of my childhood because we came here in the summer. We didn't travel and we couldn't go abroad. We couldn't go outside Albania. And so for me, every summer was spent commuting by bus from that house to this beach, and we would go to the beach just around here. Somewhere every day.
Und das muss ja sehr interessant gewesen sein. Man liegt hier am Strand. Ich war heute lange laufen dort und auch gestern Abend und man sieht permanent Italien. Das ist, man kann nicht drüber schwimmen, aber man sieht es. Also damals war das für Sie nicht die Freiheit, nicht der Ort der Freiheit, aber es wäre der Ort der Freiheit gewesen, hätten Sie es gewusst.
Yeah, I think it was a little bit of both actually. So it was, in one way you knew that it was there, and also sometimes people who swam in the beach, in the sea, if they swam too far into the sea, there would be a police force that would go and tell them, like, you've gone too far, you need to go back, otherwise it's dangerous, because people couldn't cross the border. And so it was known to me as a child that there was this other land on the other side of the sea that was very different from Albania. But we also had access to Italy through the television, because we had, and especially in the summer, there was something called a direct signal that you would pick with the antenna. If you turned the antenna in a particular way, it would give you television programs from Rai, especially Rai 1, Rai 2, so this is the main Italian state television. And that's how we knew about what was going on in Italy, and that's how we had access to Italian culture. Of course, we had a long history of relationships with Italy. It had started with the Albanian independence. The territory of Albania was being contended by different powers, and Italy, being the kind of Adriatic power, had an interest in Albania. And so that's why in the 1920s and then further on in the 30s, the then Kingdom of Albania became very closely connected to Italy and to the Kingdom of Italy and had lots of commercial relations. And then eventually Italians occupied Albania in 1939. And so it was a de facto Italian colony, but having been already quite closely connected to this colonial power through trade interactions. And so before it became militarily occupied, it was commercially occupied. And then there was this brief period in the war in which several Albanians fought the fascists. And then afterwards, Albania was occupied by the Nazis, and there was a brigade of Italian soldiers that stayed and fought with Albanian partisans against the Nazis. It was called the famous Brigata Gramsci. So there was a kind of interesting history of both animosity and enmity, but sometimes cooperation, sometimes solidarity. And throughout communism, it was the window of Albania to the West. And so then the image during the communist period changed, because it was like the face of capitalism in Albania was mediated by Italian images, Italian culture, Italian pop programs, cultural shows, music, films, and all of that was really present.
Viele gingen ja weg, alle gingen sozusagen weg, auch um sie herum. Ihr wolltet bleiben, obwohl eigentlich die Geschichte der Familie dazu hätte veranlassen können, dass man gegangen wäre. Ihr Vater war 15 Jahre lang in Haft. Warum wolltet ihr bleiben?
Because I think the idea was that the system had changed and it would now give us opportunities that we didn't have up to that point. And so it felt as though this was not the right time to leave the country. We couldn't leave anyway. Well, when we were politically oppressed, my family was a family of dissidents who had always been very critical and were always being watched by the regime. When the regime fell in 1990, they felt that now they had some autonomy and they had found freedom in this country. And so they didn't want to leave what they had found. My grandmother came from this Ottoman family, and she was born in Salonika at the point in which the Ottoman Empire had collapsed and Salonika had become a Greek city. And she had found herself having to integrate from having this imperial identity and a cosmopolitan identity that was connected to the Ottoman Empire, which didn't really exist anymore, to living in the city that was suddenly becoming Greeks, where the road names were changing and where the culture around it was changing and turning into a Greek city, even though it wasn't an experience of displacement geographically, of cultural displacement. And she felt that she was being an immigrant, and she was began to be treated as an immigrant, and she always said that living as an immigrant is not easy and it's actually very hard to integrate, you can't speak your language. Imagine us now having to leave Albania, and what would we go? We would go to the West. My father was an engineer. He said the most I could do is a driver, and my mother was a maths teacher, and she said the most I could do is a cleaner, which she also had to do when she did eventually have to leave the country. But before that, throughout the 90s, they always resisted this, because the idea was that you would go to the West and you would go to another country, but integrating had a huge cost. And so why would you take this cost rather than staying in your country and investing and trying to develop it? And I think that's plausible. I mean, immigration is not, nobody wants to leave their country. They do it when they're forced to do it. And unless you're at the very point where you really, really can't see any other way out, then you don't.
So 1990 war ein wichtiges Jahr in der Geschichte Albanien, in der Geschichte der Familie. Freiheit war auf einmal da, aber das geht natürlich eine Weile, bis es implementiert wird.
Yeah.
Die richtige Erfahrung von Freiheit war aber Ihre erste Auslandreise.
Yeah.
Erinnern Sie sich noch an die Gefühle beim Grenzübergang, beim Überschreiten der Grenze, beim Sehen, was ist denn wirklich Freiheit?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so there are a number of things that I remember. The one was that I remember in Albania, walls and buildings were filled with slogans like, you know, long live the party, or long live Enver Hoxha, or glory to communist heroes, whatever. And then you get to Greece, and I remember there were lots of scripts on the walls that were adverts, like Zara, I don't know, companies, commercial companies. And I remember thinking, is this the equivalent of, like, why are they writing this? Because to me, the writing on the wall was always a political message.
Genau, das war Propaganda, politische Propaganda.
So whenever I saw the advertising, I always thought, like, I was asking my mother, what is it that they're trying to persuade? And my grandmother was saying, no, they're just trying to persuade people to buy things. And so there was this constant thing of being told, like, you know, in the West there are no writings on walls because they don't have propaganda. But then you saw these things written and it's something different. And as a child, I remember trying to... Tashi, këtu... Djathas, po. E ke parasysh ti ku e kemi shpinë, ne?
Jo, s'kam qenë një këtu.
Prita, u ke hecë shumë.
Kemi hecë shumë?
Po, 1 minutë. Po, duhet... Apo këtu është. 1 minutë se kanë ndryshuar rruga komplet, o?
Ist das die Straße, wo Sie...
Në tregosh se se di...
Po, tashi do ecësh këtu lart. I need to show him because it's a little bit complicated. Këtu tash e para djathtas. S'ke qenë? Up here, this road was paved with cobblestones.
Ah, okay.
Very up to, yeah.
So die Häuser sind neu.
These are old, they've all been redone, basically.
Wow.
But my house is exactly how it was.
Ah,
You'll
okay.
see. So it's like, has not changed.
Ah, das liegt wirklich fast ganz oben auf dem im Berg.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just that's the house.
Ah,
So you
nice.
see it's a tiny yellow one,
Yeah.
surrounded by big, large constructions. The kitchen is very different from how it was.
Aber es zeigt noch was.
Yeah, so this is where my grandmother cooked, and my mother washed the dishes. And when she was angry, she washed them very fast and kind of smashed them a lot. This is where all the supplies came from. So my grandmother or my mother would come out of this window and would call the neighbor outside and ask for things that we didn't have. So if we had a birthday party, for example, and we didn't have enough sugar for the cake or enough flour, my mom would come here and say, "Have you got sugar? Have you got a cup of flour?" And if she didn't have it, then we'd go to the bedroom and call off the other window. So this is where a lot of interactions happened.
Kann man auch sagen, das ist ein wenig der Ort, man hat ja jeden Tag 2-3 Mal hier gegessen, ist das der Ort der philosophischen Sozialisation?
Yeah, I think so. Here and also in the living room, so in these two rooms, this is where people would hang out with each other. This is where we had, over there we had a radio, and this is where I remember hearing the first political conversations in 1990 when the system changed. I would come through this room and I remember my parents and my grandmother were glued to the radio on the table, either here or there, and listening to what was going on in Albania and talking about political protests and political pluralism. And so it's a place of not just childhood domestic family memories, but also of political memories and events that shaped the history of the country and that in many ways changed all of our lives. I remember when I was a child and I lived here, and Albania was a communist country and it was a very isolated country. It never crossed either my mind or my parents' mind to think that things could be in any way different from how they became. They never thought this kitchen would look anything like different from how it was, and that we wouldn't be here anymore, that other people would live in this house, and that we would all be scattered around the world, or that I now live in London. So it's good because I think it's important to know that history moves on and that things change. But in some ways, it's also bad because it reminds you that it can move on in many different directions, and that you can't predict the direction in which it goes and in which it turns, and that all the things that we have, both the ones that we cherish and the ones that we dislike, are not there to stay.
If everybody are ready, we start.
Yeah.
Lea Ypi, wir sitzen hier in Durres, Ihrer Heimat. Hier sind Sie aufgewachsen, im Albanien, im kommunistischen Albanien. Heute leben Sie in England. Sie sind mittlerweile auch Engländerin, haben einen britischen Pass, lernen in der London School of Economics, sind dort Professorin für politische Theorien. Das ist ja ein Wandel und eigentlich die Frage, was bedeuten für Sie in Ihrem Leben Grenzen?
I think there's different ways of talking about boundaries. There's a physical boundary, which is what we often think of when we think of boundaries. We think of the line that demarcates a territory, that demarcates a space, and that defines one space and distinguishes one space from another. But I also think that the deeper meaning of boundaries is conceptual, that physical boundaries in themselves are meaningless. They are only meaningful and they only have an impact and make an impact of people insofar as there is an understanding of what the boundaries are that is political and philosophical and conceptual that is attached to the physical boundary. So I think the boundary for me is mental and is a category of thought, which is to say it's a category of politics, of institutions, of the meanings that societies and people ascribe to what the boundary is, and that then gets projected into markers that we tend to think of as physical markers. And so if I think about the boundaries in my life, they were often presented themselves to begin with as physical boundaries. In Durres, for example, it was the boundary that was defined by the Adriatic Sea. So I grew up here and we were divided by Italy from the Adriatic Sea. But the boundary as such, the physical boundary, wasn't in itself important. It was only important insofar as it meant something to us. And what it meant to us was a reflection of the politics and the categories that both on this side of the boundary and on that side of the boundary were attached to it, and that made people think about the boundary in a certain way.
Das betrifft die innere Freiheit, das Denken. Es gibt natürlich die äußeren Grenzen, die auferlegt werden. Sie sind Philosophin. Philosophie ist natürlich die Disziplin, wo man Grenzen überschreiten soll, zumindest im Denken. Diese Grenzen beschäftigen uns in Europa in der Gegenwart permanent. Die nationalen Grenzen, die politischen Grenzen, die sozialen Grenzen, die Klassengesellschaftsgrenzen, die Sie auch immer wieder thematisiert haben. Wie überwindet man Grenzen in einer politischen Realität und mit welchem philosophischen Konzept?
So I've always been also very interested in the philosophical concepts of the boundary or of the limit. And one of the authors that I have been working on and exploring for a very long time is Kant. And Kant's philosophy is all about the boundaries of knowledge and the relationship between knowledge on the one hand and what we can know, and the limits of what we can know, so the boundaries of what we can know. And once we understand those limits, what we can do with the rest. So once we know that there are certain things that we won't have answers to, what are the things that we can have answers to and that we can work out together? And the question of the boundary is connected to the question of faith and of belief and also of freedom. So the question of the boundary, philosophically, is connected to the discovery of what it means to be free human being. And the answer in the philosophical tradition that I am most interested in is one that says, first of all, we have to understand that we are bound by reason, and that there are certain boundaries of knowledge, certain boundaries of things that we can figure out for ourselves, and things that we can figure out historically and politically. And for me, the question of the philosophical question of freedom is then connected to the political question of freedom. So there is a philosophical dimension of knowing that once we know the limits of reason, what can we do with those limits, and how can we create a society in which we can all interact with each other as rational human beings who have reason, who can work out institutions and practices of relationship to each other that reflect rationality, that reflect human reason. And then asking yourself the critical question of, do the societies in which we live up to this philosophical idea of freedom that we can work out through thought and through history and through knowledge of politics and history?
Die Idee von Demokratie, von Freiheit stammt ja nicht aus der Aufklärung, sondern hier um die Ecke in Griechenland. In der Philosophie ist Griechenland und die griechische Philosophie sehr wichtig für jeden, der Philosophie lehrt und studiert. Diese aristotelische Idee der Freiheit, der Demokratie oder dann später Platon, die war ja super modern, aber irgendwie konnten wir sie noch nicht umsetzen, wenn es zur Frage kommt, wie funktioniert das Verhältnis zwischen Individuum, Gesellschaft, Machtapparaten, Politik, Verwaltung, Bürokratien. Also diese ganze Konstruktion, in der wir leben, zeigt immer wieder, dass wir an Grenzen kommen und dass es schwierig ist, das alles unter einen Hut zu bringen. Und am Schluss ist auch die Frage, wo ist das Individuum, die Bürgerin und der Bürger in diesem ganzen Konstrukt?
I think, again, here there's a dual way of thinking about democracy. So there is a sense in which one thinks about democracy as in the classical idea of democracy, which is the equality of people who make decisions within a bounded political community. And I think the Greek idea of democracy is one where it's very clear who is a citizen and who is not a citizen. And democracy only works with, or begins to work with, that idea that there is a part of the people, the demos, who is excluded and are not even considered people. So if you think of Aristotle, the slaves, the women, these are not really part of the demos. It's only a demos of restricted subjects that can make political decisions. And then you have the more, I think, modern idea of democracy, which is one that is, at least in principle, genuinely universally inclusive, and where everyone who has rationality and every human being is in principle a member of this community that needs to make decisions and need to make decisions that in some ways reflect themselves and their freedom. What makes, I think, modern democracy really interesting and really promising as an ideal is that it is exactly an ideal that starts with freedom. So the idea is we make decisions and we are the subject of laws, we're the subject of power, we're the subjects of institutions. How can we legitimate these institutions? How can we produce forms of decision making that in some ways make those institutions still the result of our will, of our decisions? And that's where the idea of democracy emerges. The idea is that when I make a democratic decision, I authorize an institution. I make a decision with others, I have a deliberation, I have discussion, and I am the author of the laws to which I am asked to comply with. And therefore, yes, I am a subject of the law, I'm constrained, I'm coerced because I'm being asked to do certain things. But on the other hand, so I lose freedom in that sense because I'm the subject of an institution. But on the other hand, I am also the one who has authorized the institution. That's why democracy is such an interesting concept, because I think it's the only form of political decision-making that is able to channel freedom in this way, that is able to say to someone, you're free to the extent that you are the author of the laws that you are required to obey. And again, this is also why it's a philosophical idea, because in the world in which we live, not everyone has the same power and the same capacity to make these laws. People have very different, the institutions and the rules that we abide with track people's wills in very different ways. If you are an immigrant and you don't have the capacity to participate in these forms of decision making, then you are officially or formally in a democracy, but substantively you are not the author of the laws that you are required to obey. And so this idea already in that category clearly shows itself to be more of an ideal than the institutional reality that we live under.
Partizipation ist ja ohnehin eine ganz wichtige Größe in der Demokratie. Ohne Partizipation funktioniert Demokratie nicht. Wir sehen heute in Europa, dass die Partizipation der Bürgerinnen und Bürger, gar nicht zu sprechen von den Immigranten und Asylsuchenden, die gar nicht wählen und abstimmen dürfen, aber diese Partizipation wird immer kleiner und die Diskussionen, die Res Publica verlagert sich in Felder und in Sphären, nicht nur die digitale, die für die Demokratie gar nicht mehr greifbar sind. Ist also die Demokratie heute gefährdet aufgrund schlichter Tatsache, dass die Partizipation zu klein wird?
Yes, but I think the fact that people are disaffected from contemporary democracies is more of a result than the explanation of what is going on. So I think the reason people are disaffected is that they feel institutions don't respond to them anymore. And the reason they feel institutions don't respond to them anymore is that I think we're at a juncture of political and economic institutions connecting to each other in such a way that the people who have less power and less money also have less political voice. And if you're in that economic predicament, if you live in societies where you have in principle an idea of democracy, but in practice political parties act like cartel parties, where you don't have genuine representation, where political elites collude with each other and create forms of disenfranchisement of people who don't have the same political and economic opportunities, then people start losing faith in the system because the system doesn't deliver for them. So I think it's a result of the political and economic asymmetries that we have that have been set in motion in Western Europe over the course of a very long time, that there is this disaffection with democracy and this idea that liberal democracy isn't delivering and isn't tracking people's wills. If we had alternative arrangements in place of both an economic and a political kind, if we had different forms of decision making, if we had more accountability, if we had market economies that worked for everyone, that gave opportunities equally to everyone, if we had genuine social democracy, then I think you wouldn't have this divorce between the institutions on the one hand and the people on the other, and you would find people caring much more about those institutions, whereas what you have now is a sense of alienation and detachment and disenchantment with the kind of democracy that people are being required to participate, because they realize that even if they participate, even if they vote, even if they make certain decisions, they don't really track who they are and they don't really track their beliefs.
Vieles, was Sie jetzt erwähnt haben, hat auch sehr stark mit dem Jahr 1989 zu tun, mit dem Fall der Mauer. Hier später in Albanien mit dem Bruch mit dem kommunistischen System. Was ist denn in dieser Zeit schiefgegangen? Was hat vielleicht das westliche, sogenannte westliche Europa nicht berücksichtigt damals, dass wir heute, 30 Jahre später, mit unglaublich großen Problemen konfrontiert sind?
I think it's perhaps this belief that economic freedom would deliver political equality, and the idea that if you create market societies of a certain kind, namely the neoliberal market societies that took hold of Eastern Europe after 1990, which is grounded on this idea of free individual initiative, of free market enterprise, of economic activities that are unbounded by the state, where the responsibility of the state is to stand back and let private actors take over and organize institutions in a way that simply track market imperatives. I think it's this. Perhaps what we have seen over the last 30 years is exactly this disillusionment with this idea that market societies don't necessarily deliver political equality, and they don't necessarily deliver democracy, and they also don't necessarily deliver for everyone. They only deliver for some but not for others. And yet, when they only deliver for some and not for others, you create societies that are alienated, where you have a degree of anomie that becomes very difficult to control and to organize politically for everyone. And so life then becomes unsustainable for everyone. So it's this system that I think has somehow collapsed this belief that giving economic freedom would result to a type of living in common that would reflect these ideas of democracy, and just understanding that that's not how it has worked in the last 30 years, that market economies have produced huge costs and have come at often catastrophic consequences for a lot of people. And so the shutting down of state enterprises has generated huge problems with unemployment, which has then led to emigration, which has led to brain drain, which has led to a series of social consequences that have been destructive both for Eastern societies but also for Western societies because of the impact that it has had over both of them.
Freiheit ist ein wichtiges Thema in Ihrer Philosophie, in Ihrem philosophischen Arbeiten. Und man könnte jetzt alles sagen, all das, was Sie jetzt beschrieben haben, das ist ja eine Konsequenz der Freiheit. Und da die Frage, ab wann wird denn Freiheit selbst zur Ideologie?
I think it's a consequence of a particular way of thinking about freedom. And that's what I try to articulate in my work, is to try and talk about the different ways in which we understand freedom. There is a classical liberal idea of freedom which does precisely what we have just been saying, which is to say you are free to the extent that nobody interferes with you, to the extent that the state doesn't tell you what to do, where to go, what to wear, as the state did in Albania under communism. So there was a glaring absence of this precisely liberal, more negative idea of freedom, which is the freedom from. And then in 1990, this type of freedom was returned to the people. So now you have freedom of thought and freedom of association and freedom of conscience, freedom of practicing religious beliefs. And so you have a return of those classical liberal freedoms. But then you ask yourself, is the freedom to live under the bridge a real freedom? Or is the freedom to be unemployed, or is the kind of freedom that a person who is unemployed enjoys real freedom? And what does it mean to have freedom that doesn't come with opportunities to realize yourself? that's, I think, a shift in the way in which we think about freedom that tells us that freedom can be both an ideal, but that it can also be manipulated politically and ideologically and can be interpreted in different ways in different social systems, and that you can be told you live in a free society, but philosophically ask yourself the question of, are you really truly free in a society in which you are being left to your own devices, in which there is no form of solidarity, in which there are no social practices that enable people to realize themselves and to live in a community with others? And all of these questions then raise big doubts concerning the kinds of social systems that we live under now.
Aber diese Frage für jemanden, der ja in beiden Systemen gelebt hat, Sie hatten hier in Albanien gelebt unter dem kommunistischen Regime, da waren Sie noch ein Kind, eine Jugendliche. Und dann kam die große Freiheit, Sie sind dann weg von Albanien nach Italien, haben studiert Philosophie. Sie kennen beide Systeme. Und da ist natürlich die Frage, die innere Freiheit, die ja hier auch geherrscht hat während der kommunistischen Diktatur, war die vielleicht sogar größer, als sie sein kann in einer demokratischen Umgebung?
So I think, for me, the question of personal freedom is a very complicated one. The question of internal freedom is a very complicated one. Because I think, and we started by talking philosophically about this idea of freedom, I think there is a dimension of freedom, this is internal dimension of freedom, that can never be taken away from a human being, regardless of what system they live under. And so, for me, the philosophical idea of freedom is connected to the concept of dignity. Dignity is something that belongs to people, and that no totalitarian system, however oppressive, however manipulative, however ideological, can ever completely take away from someone. There's something that makes the person that they are, that makes them a human being, and that's connected to this moral dimension of freedom. But having said that, there is also an external dimension of freedom, which is always appropriated by institutions in particular ways, and which is always then put to the service of ideological ends. And when you mentioned the experience of living both sort of under a communist system and under a liberal system, for me, the example that really brought home this ideological way of thinking about freedom was the example of freedom of movement. So in Albania, we didn't have freedom of movement because we couldn't leave the country. You would be shot at the border if you tried to leave the country. Before 1990, people were persecuted, their entire families were sent to prison if they tried to leave Albania. So the border could not be crossed because your own soldiers would shoot you at the border. And then in 1990, everything changed, and so the state wasn't preventing people to leave anymore. But what you had was, you had freedom to exit, but then suddenly Western European countries began to realize that they couldn't cope with the mass of people that were coming from Eastern Europe. And so the people, the dissidents who had been greeted as heroes until a month before, a month after became criminals who had to be stopped at the border. And suddenly it was no longer your own police force that was stopping you from leaving, but it was the countries, the neighboring countries, Italy or Greece or whoever would be your neighboring country, that would stop you at the border. So the color of police uniforms had changed, but if you care about freedom of movement, you should care about it both whether you're leaving a country or entering in a country. And if you respect freedom of movement, you should respect it, whether it's your own state who prevents you from exiting or whether it's another state that prevents you from entering. And this shows you how, in theory, it's about freedom, and everyone says, of course, we care about freedom of movement, but when someone does the dirty work of holding people at the border, then it's not your responsibility. And when someone no longer does that, then it becomes your responsibility. And then the ideology shows itself to be what it is, just an ideological way of packaging this idea of freedom.
Wir haben jetzt viel gesprochen über die jüngere Vergangenheit. Natürlich war die Wende, war dieses Zusammenbringen von Ost und West ein Riesenprojekt in Europa. Ein Wirtschaftsprojekt, politisches Projekt, kulturelles, soziales Projekt. Heute in der Gegenwart haben wir aber immer noch diese Fragestellung der Migration. Einfach mit neuen Beispielen, mit anderen Vorzeichen, mit anderen Namen. Wir sehen es jetzt bei den verschiedenen kriegerischen Handlungen, sei es in Syrien, Afghanistan oder dann jetzt jüngst in Ukraine. Die Migration ist immer noch die größte politische Herausforderung in einem Europa, das hier für Freiheit, Liberalität und Offenheit steht. Wo ist das Problem?
Well, I don't think migration is a problem as such. And in fact, the first problem is in how we think about and how we conceptualize migration as a problem. So I think the first act of deconstruction has to be one that says migration is about the movement of people. And the movement of people as such is not a problem because people have been moving from one place to the other since the beginnings of humanity. So it's not about migration as such. Migration is only a problem in a context of global injustice. And so you have to ask yourself, what is it that leads to migration, and how are different countries and how are different economic and political practices contributing to a type of migration that comes with power asymmetries that then affect different people in different ways. And the first, and again, I mean, so thinking about migration, when you think about the different kinds of migrants that you have in society, it's never about the rich migrants. It's a person who moves and goes from one country to another country is always a migrant. So I am a migrant in the United Kingdom. But when the United Kingdom has a problem with the immigrant, it's not me that they have in mind. It's not an academic who can go and contribute, or it's not an athlete, or it's not a pop star. It's not the migrant with privileges and knowledge and skills that they can contribute. It's the migrant that is a reflection of a certain form of deprivation that they come with, and that is seen as an obstacle to development, without thinking of how those very countries that are hostile to migration are contributing to making migration a problem as such in this particular way, in this the migration of certain categories of people and not other categories of people. So I always say that for me the question of migration is very closely connected to the question of social class. And so you have to ask yourself, what do these migrants represent in terms of socioeconomic background, in terms of class configuration, and how do they contribute? And it's never, and migration is not a problem as such, it's only a problem in the context of a global picture of injustice that we have to be concerned with.
Das zeigt sich ja schon in der Sprache. Migrantinnen wie Sie sind vielleicht eher Expats und die anderen sind eben Arbeitsflüchtlinge. Dieses reiche Europa braucht ja diese Menschen, weil sie gar keine Menschen mehr finden, die diese Arbeiten tun würden, die dann diese tun. Also diese Klassenfrage, die Sie erwähnt haben, ist aber auch eine Art kolonialistische Sache im Umgang mit der Realität, weil wir holen ja diese Menschen und brauchen diese Menschen für diese Arbeit.
Yeah, and again, the question that is interesting there is that I think it's hard to think of job shortages, for example, or scarcity in the labor market in the abstract. You have to think about why certain categories of migrants are required to perform certain jobs, and it's usually because they come and they don't have rights. So again, the migrants that are welcome and favored, and there is a certain discourse that says, well, we need migration, we need labor force, and so on. But what they really mean is a labor force that comes disempowered, that comes without rights. And and one of the biggest problems that creates a rift in how we think about social classes, how we think about mobilization of the labor force, and also the, in some ways, fragility of the labor movement in the last 30 years, and the divides that migration as a problem has caused in the labor movement, come exactly from the fact that migrants are often come and don't have rights and don't have citizenship and don't have the political voice and the political power to make a change in the countries in which they arrive. And then native workers who are connected to a labor movement, are often unionized and have all the privileges that come with unionization, that are not entering into a coalition with these other labor force. And so you have a labor movement that is divided as a result of citizenship policies and as a result of migration practices that leave certain groups of workers without rights and disenfranchised, and have other groups of workers that can then be courted by right-wing movements or by the far right that says, well, it's about protecting citizenship. And of course, in some ways, it is about protecting citizenship because it's citizenship that is giving them the privileges. But the problem is further down, and it's deeper, and it has to do with exactly the kinds of rights and duties that citizenship confers, and the way we think about citizenship in contemporary Europe and how we connect that to nationality.
Nun, lange hat ja die Sozialdemokratie in Europa genau diese Menschen vertreten, die Arbeiterinnen und Arbeiter, diese Klasse. Das hat sich dann aber stark gewandelt. Heute ist die Sozialdemokratie vielleicht jene, die die Institutionen mehr vertritt und die rechten Parteien vertreten vielleicht wieder diese einfachere Bevölkerung in Anführungszeichen. Was ist denn da passiert?
So I think basically social democracy has lost its revolutionary potential, so to speak. So I think it's gone from the social democracy was born as a movement that wasn't trying to live with capitalism. It was trying to think about citizenship and the state in a way that would transform the state in an anti-capitalist direction. But the project was never one of coexistence. So in the founding fathers of social democracy, if you think of the work of Bernstein, or if you think of the point at which this tradition begins to develop as its own distinctive tradition, the question wasn't really a question of how can you moderate capitalism. The question was always, and has always been, that capitalism and democracy aren't really compatible. So if you want to have democracy, you need to overcome capitalism in the direction of forms of economic management and political accountability that are different from the ones that capitalism enables. I think the problem with social democracy begins at the point in which this project is lost and where social democracy becomes a project of trying to accommodate people to the reality of capitalism. I think in the 90s in Eastern Europe, there was this moment, this opening, which I often think back of as we think about counterfactual history and how you can, what you can learn from these dissident movements in Eastern Europe in the 90s, where it was very, at least seems to me, to a number of dissidents in Eastern Europe, was the limits of capitalism were also clear. And so there was this moment where people were trying to go beyond state socialism, but not necessarily towards globalized economic capitalism, where there was an alternative effort to come up with an alternative project that would try to overcome capitalism, but also give maximal democracy at a political level. And for me, it's that promise that's sort of interesting when you think about those pro-democracy movements in the 90s that began in Eastern Europe and the sort of the dissidents, and what was particularly powerful about their message was exactly this effort to try to move beyond state socialism and beyond the forms of oppression and censorship that existed all over Eastern Europe under those communist governments. But also giving up on those didn't mean necessarily turning towards, as I say, a capitalist economic structure and a politics that would then have to accommodate itself to this capitalist reality.
Es ist auch ein gutes Beispiel dafür, dass Probleme, Herausforderungen, die politisch nicht lösbar sind, die Klimakonferenzen haben ja vieles nicht erreichen können, die dann erst letztlich durch die Ökonomie gelöst wird. Also erst wenn die Probleme ökonomisierbar werden, sei es in der Klimafrage, sei es aber auch in der Arbeits- oder Migrationsfrage, dann werden Lösungen zum Teil gefunden, zum Teil sogar gute. Ist das nicht etwas paradox?
I don't think this, because I don't think that the spheres are as disconnected. I think in the end it's about problem solving and the capacities that we have to come up with solutions. And
Na gut, aber die Frage ist, werden die Probleme gelöst in Parlamenten oder in Wirtschaftsetagen bei Manager?
Well, you have an ideal, I think, of how they should be resolved, but you also have an empirical process that leads to whether this ideal can be realized or not. And so I think you have to take stock of the political reality that you have, and the political reality that we have is one where economic decisions have a much greater weight, because that's what it means to live under capitalism. And if we're not aware of that, then we have missed a big part of what's going on in the world right now. The fact that the economic sphere, economic interactions, do take priority in the world in which we live. The question is, what can you do with that starting point, and how can you build a critique of society that starts with that and then shows you that this is not what real freedom looks like, or that this is not what a society that claims to enable people to kind of reach their potential looks like.
Man kann sagen, alles ist relativ, alles ist im Wandel, nichts ist stabil oder absolut, gerade in Demokratien. Um auf Kant zurückzugehen, die Demokratie ist ja keine einfache Sache. Eine ganz wesentliche Grundlage der Demokratie ist das Wissen, die Bildung und eben die genannte Partizipation. Gerade beim Brexit, aber auch in vielen anderen Diskussionen ist ja gar nicht mehr so klar, was ist wahr, was ist nicht wahr, was ist verbrieftes Wissen, alternative Realitäten, alternative Geschichtsnarrative. Alles zerbricht ein wenig unter den Händen. Die Agora, die ja so wichtig war in der griechischen Philosophie, nämlich der öffentliche Markt, wo man die Dinge verhandelt, zerfällt auch. Wenn all das so instabil und relativ wird, was passiert dann in unseren Gesellschaften?
A I think these are fragmentations, that these forms of fragmentation are not entirely disconnected from the political economic predicament that we live under. And I don't think they're entirely disconnected from the kind of market practices that we have or from the forms of political representation that are connected to these market practices. I don't think they're disconnected from the financial crisis that happened a few years ago. They're not disconnected from the legacy and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the kind of the European configuration. So I think all these different types of fragmentation, I think they're parts of bits of a larger puzzle, which has to do with the current political economic predicament that we're in and with the model of development that we need to challenge as a system, where I think it's not enough to criticize one part or one particular state or one particular group of people within a state, but you need to have a larger form of criticism and a form of social imagination that tries to put all these different things together and to kind of put in place a form of critical thinking that is about the system as a whole. And I think that is, and this is where it starts, this is why I think it also starts with thought, because it requires a universal outlook and a way of thinking that isn't itself fragmentary, that isn't itself, that requires a kind of belief in the capacity to bring together, to have these overarching narratives, where I think the discourse, the critique of modernity and the postmodern discourses in philosophically that we've been having over the last few years have exactly tried to challenge that, this idea that there can't be a general form of thinking or that there can't be a way of engaging with each other that brings under a larger vision or under a larger systemic critique. And I think so it begins with trying to recover the power of thought and the power of critical thinking. And with that critical thinking, then building forms of knowledge and forms of understanding of society that go beyond the boundaries that we construct, whether it's ethnic boundaries or political boundaries, and they try to take, again, going back to Kant, the world as its unit of concern and the problems of the world as such, and then finds different specific problems in different parts of the world, but also finds the general connections between these different problems. And so for as long as we go on thinking that the problems of Albania are only the problems of Albania and all it takes is for the Albanians to solve their own problems, I think we will have missed something important about the general configuration that we're in, and we will have also deprived ourselves of a very important tool of social critique.
Dieses kritische Denken, das muss ja auf Wissen basieren und Sie haben es erwähnt, in dieser Art von Fragmentisierung wird der gemeinsame Nenner, the common ground, wird ja immer kleiner. Wie kann man dann über eine Gesellschaft diskutieren, wenn der gemeinsame Nenner kleiner wird, die Fragmentierung größer wird und die sozusagen alternativen Narrative immer mehr die Leute beeinflussen, ohne dass sie das wissen, sei es aufgrund der digitalen Entwicklung, aber sei es auch aufgrund vielleicht eines politischen Establishments, das vielleicht noch mehr lügt als früher schon.
I think, I mean, there the question of thought, I don't think is separate from the question of political action. So I think we need to create ways of mobilizing politically and sites of political mobilization that bring people together and create conversations that enable them to find what they have in common and then expand these conversations.
Aber wer ist wir?
I think we can start with social movements, and we can start with just the concerns that people have in their local communities. You can start with, you know, someone has a very small problem that they think is only their problem, and then connect that problem and try to understand how that connects to a larger perspective, or how it's not just their problem, but it's a shared problem. I think one of the dramas of the last 30 years, when I think about Albania or Eastern Europe more generally, is that all the consequences of the fall of the wall, of this failed liberalization of the process, we have lived with years and years of individualizing social tragedies. So people see something happen, and it's always a person that has lost their life. It's always an individual tragedy. And we never put together these individual tragedies to try and think about, okay, but surely there is a shared root there, and there is a source of the problem that isn't just this problem. You have someone who loses their life trying to cross the Mediterranean, and it's an accident that just happened to them. Or you have someone who loses a job and it's just something that happened to them. Or you have someone that has a problem on the motorway because there's been deregulation. And so there's all these smaller scale tragedies that we individualize, and we never think of how do they all come together. And I think what we need is forms of political conversation, which of course parties so I start by talking about social movements because they are closer to the issues, and so you can have issue-based concerns. But then you have the next level, which is the political parties need to be in touch with the social movements and in touch with these forms of grievance that are individual and rooted locally and specific to a context, to try and enable conversations that show people how it's actually not just their problem, it's a shared problem, and it's something that can be solved via collective action. And also to try and explain, how, why, and how this happens within this broader economic context. So I think it's not a work that any particular individual thinker can do, or any particular philosophy, or any particular party. It's the work of democracy. It's the work of just coming together and coming to these forms of social awareness and creating the types of discourse that enable people to have these conversations. This conversation is a kind of discourse, but there's many others going on out there.
Aber die klassische Demokratie basiert natürlich auf politischen Parteien. Was wir in den letzten Jahren gesehen haben, ist, dass die politischen Parteien immer schwächer werden, aber die Bewegungen immer stärker werden, bis hin sozusagen auch zu Ministerpräsidenten und Präsidenten, die gewählt werden. Ist das politische Parteiensystem, das so eminent wichtig war für die Demokratie, ist das in Gefahr?
I think yes and no. I think the parties specifically, concretely, are in crisis. But I don't think the party form is in crisis yet, because I can't think of another mechanism of making political decisions that is connected both to the life of citizens as voluntary actors, as members of civil society organizations, and to the life of laws. So what the parties do is they have this intermediary function between, on the one hand, the sphere of civil society, of interactions that are voluntary, of people individually engaging with each other, on the one hand, but also they have a connection to institutions. And you need both of these things, because you need laws to turn things, to turn initiatives into forms of decision-making that are binding and that can hold citizens to account, and can hold politicians to account by citizens, but you also need the initiatives on the ground. And I think one of the problems, one of the things that has gone wrong in the last few years is this divorce between civil society on the one hand and political parties on the other, or with social movements going one way and political parties going another way. Political parties have become too institutional and too co-opted and too involved in the state, and have also transformed themselves as a result of economic pressure into cartel parties, into parties that don't really reflect different forms of dialogue and different ideologies and different political conversations. So the parties have become too institutional, too co-opted, and also too much part of the elite in the wrong way. And social movements, on the other hand, have become completely isolated. And so there's a lot of life on the ground when it comes to social movements, but then it results into very little when it turns to policy and law, because you don't have this mechanism that mediates between those two, because parties have lost this function that they used to have. And so I think that, I don't think that's a lost cause. I think it can be recovered, but to be recovered, it needs to be coupled with the critique of the system. I don't think it can be just recovered in the abstract by itself. You have to ask yourself, why did the parties get to this point? What happened in the economy? What happened in society more general to make these transformations possible? And how can you then recover this spirit of partisanship and democratic engagement that is the democratic function that parties have played traditionally when they played that role at their best?
Ein Problem der Demokratie ist ja die sogenannte Kurzfristigkeit, das Wahlsystem. Die Exekutive wird meistens für 4-5 Jahre gewählt und bereits nach 2-3 Jahren im Amt beginnt schon wieder der Wahlkampf. Das heißt, kann ein integres, würdiges politisches System überhaupt funktionieren mit dieser Art von Zyklen?
I think it's possible. But for me, the problem is not so much the cycle, the temporal cycle. For me, the problem is more the restrictions on the boundaries of where these decisions happen. So I think the 4-year cycle is not necessarily a problem, because it's something that enables a kind of learning process to be in place, and that enables taking stock of certain decisions that were made and then revisiting them. And so it's a self-correcting mechanism. But what is problematic is the fact that these 4-year cycles are completely different in different countries, and that they're not integrated. So you have an institution like the European Union that makes certain economic decisions that are in some ways hugely consequential for the lives of the citizens of those who live under this institution, who are affected by these decisions, financial or about now war, energy or military or defense or what have you, so hugely important decisions, all of which are taken in some ways without coordinating politically these elections and these mechanisms, and with parties that just run on national platforms, on national election dates, so the whole representative system is basically narrowed down by the boundaries of the states in which they happen, and there isn't coordination, even though the decisions are made at European level. And for me, the thing that needs to change is the rethinking of citizenship, and with it the rethinking of elections and political representation beyond these national boundaries, in such a way that you can create forms of political will formation that transcend these national boundaries. And then the four-year cycle can continue, but it needs to be a wider four-year cycle. It can't just be that, Germany has it at this point, and France has it at this point, and Italy has it at this point. It needs to be much more tightly integrated and connected, and with parties that ideally would also coordinate their policies and their alternative offerings. And so they would also coordinate their agendas in much more stronger ways.
Das sagt die Philosophin. Platon hat mal gesagt, erst wenn die Politiker Philosophen werden und die Philosophen Politiker, dann wird alles gut. Haben Sie sich wirklich schon darüber Gedanken gemacht, mal ganz konkret in die Politik zu gehen?
No, because I think there is a division of labor in society and you need both. And I think it works best if you have both. The timing of thought and the times of philosophy are a lot longer, and the times of politics are a lot shorter. And I think you need the longer time frame to be able to detect trends and to have forms of criticism that you wouldn't have if you were just held up by this political schedule. And so I think the life of the politician is much shorter than the life of thinking, and I don't think it's a good idea to mix them. I also think that what's really important is to have channels of communication in society where philosophical ideas can filter on the ground and be taken on by citizens, and where citizens can become philosophers rather than philosophers becoming rulers. And that's, I think, a much more, for a democratic predicament, a much more benign development than having rulers that are philosophers.
Sie haben in Ihrer Familiengeschichte alles gehabt, Dissidenten, Feudalisten, Leute, die in der Politik waren. Sie haben hier das kritische Denken in diesem Haus, in dieser Familie gelernt. Ganz wichtig war Ihre Mutter und Ihre Großmutter, also die Frauenfiguren. Was hat sie so unterschieden von den Männerfiguren?
They were very strong women. They were very different, and they exercised their strength and their power in very different ways. But they were not subdued women. They were not women that thought they were in any way inferior to men. Even when they thought they were placed by society in positions of inferiority, they somehow turned that dynamic against itself and sort of found ways of appropriating power, even though, as I say, they lived in a man's world, both of them. And for me, it was very important when I moved and when I changed countries, especially because as a migrant, when you go to a different country, the question of integration becomes really a live one. It's the first question you ask yourself is, how am I going to fit in? Nobody knows me, nobody speaks my language, nobody knows anything about me. They don't know anything about my past. They will just put me in a box and leave me in that box. And how can I emerge out of the box? And that requires a lot of, I think, self-confidence. And that self-confidence, I think, was given to me by these women models that I had grown up with who were hugely confident. I always think that we don't pay enough attention there when we think, for example, of women's emancipation and women's rights and so on, which is a dimension of class that we don't think of. So when often I get invited to give a lot of talks about women in philosophy and, how can you be, and often these are talks about, empowerment and how can you empower other women with your example, or how can you look at this idea of the role model is very important. And I often say that I would not be able to do the jobs that I do, and I would not have the opportunities that I have if there wasn't some other woman coming from some other part of the world that is taking care of my children, often an immigrant woman, and often someone who comes from a very deprived background. And there is a sense in which I think to think about both gender questions and race questions, for me, the most productive way to think of them is as connected to questions of economic and social disenfranchisement, and so connected to social class as well. And that's where I'm generally more skeptical of the discourse around women's empowerment that has just to do with quotas and just to do with ticking boxes and with, let's say, identity politics reduced to just forms of identity representation that are disconnected from also social representation more generally.
Und da sind wir wieder bei der Freiheit. Also die Freiheit der Sprache wird auch zusehends ein wenig limitiert. Macht Ihnen das Sorgen?
Yeah, absolutely. To be critical, you need all perspectives. And you need all perspectives to be able to articulate themselves in as open way as possible as they can. And you also have to have a certain faith that underneath all these perspectives, there is a humanity that shapes people and that is common to all of them. And that at the end of the day, we all have something that is reason, that makes us make certain decisions and leads us to certain conclusions. There's patterns of thought that we all share. And from there, you can gain the confidence that even though debates look polarized, even though it looks like speech is very difficult, even though there are forms of political and economic manipulation, even though there are forms of power disenfranchisement and there are forms of disadvantage that shape our ability to engage in language as well, it's also important to know that none of these, I started at the beginning by saying that none of these can really remove this capacity that people have. And if you have that faith, then the conversations will take a different form. They will develop in different ways. They will develop politically as well in different ways. And so I think the question of speech is one where you need to be able to articulate the perspectives as openly as possible to even be able to see the limits of speech. If they're not articulated, then you don't see the limits.
Was wünschen Sie sich für das Europa von heute und von morgen? Beziehungsweise was muss in diesem Europa jetzt dringend angegangen werden?
I wish for a Europe that isn't just thinking of itself as Europe. So I hope that Europe will realize, and the Europeans will realize, that we care about Europe and we care about European institutions because they reflect universal ideas, and that if they don't reflect these ideas, they're just as parochial and just as exclusionary and just as problematic and just as likely to lead to the same historical mistakes that European nations have made throughout their history when they thought of themselves as the site, the cradle of civilizations and of ideas. And so I hope for a Europe that is sufficiently critical of itself to be able to understand that we're all part of world history and world historical processes where it's about the unit of concern is the world and the subjects that make the world are human beings. And these divisions that we have between different states or between boundaries are just contingent divisions that are there to reflect certain political and economic processes that are also contingent political and economic processes, but where in the end I think freedom is not there and will only be there if we think of ourselves critically in that way.
Das heißt, ein Europa der Zukunft kann nur reüssieren und nicht scheitern, wenn Freiheit wirklich vorhanden ist für alle gleichberechtigt.
Yes, but for the whole world, not just for Europe.
Lea Ypi, vielen Dank für das Gespräch.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
That was a tour de force. Thank you. Yeah.
Could not let you miss my mind. Vedam hanam ban shosni. Veç për ty dashtu n'qaj. Pse s'vjen mas diçka të Could not let you miss my mind. Vetëm hanam ban shoqni. Veç për ty dashtu n'qaj. Pse s'vjen mas diçka të bëj. chikiu eya janin me machetsu smalein lata dial me chikiu eya janin me machetsu